Imagine opening your mailbox, not to a bill, but to a certified letter demanding $10,000, all because of your dog. This wasn't theft or vandalism or even a party complaint. It was a calculated attack from the people swearing to protect the neighborhood. They thought a fine this absurd would crush her into submission. They were wrong. The question is, how far would you go to dismantle the authority that tried to ruin your life?
Before the certified letters and the staggering fines, there was simply Laura and the quiet perfection of Pelican Creek. It was the kind of neighborhood where the lawns were uniformly green, the mailboxes matched, and the promise of a peaceful life had drawn her in. Laura was a portrait of quiet competence, a financial analyst who valued order, routine, and the simple joy of coming home to a sanctuary. Her greatest vice, perhaps, was spoiling her miniature poodle, Barnaby, a fluffy 4-pound cloud of mischief who was fiercely loyal and utterly adored. The HOA, known formally as the Pelican Creek Community Board, wasn't a faceless entity in the beginning. It was run by a collection of neighbors, chief among them a man named Arthur, whose starched shirts and perpetual air of self-importance gave him the bearing of a small-town potentate. Arthur had served on the board for over a decade. In his world, compliance wasn't just required, it was a moral imperative. He saw the community's rules not as guidelines, but as a rigid framework he alone was meant to enforce. Laura's life revolves around early morning walks with Barnaby along the community's pristine, manicured paths. It was a ritual of tranquility, a gentle start to a demanding workday. But the peace of Pelican Creek was about to be shattered, not by a major infraction, but by the most minor, most inevitable part of pet ownership. Arthur, the self-appointed guardian of perfection, was watching, waiting, and soon, a routine morning walk would become the single flashpoint that ignited a devastating war for control of the entire neighborhood.
The first shot in the war wasn't a warning, it was a demand. The infamous certified letter, delivered on a Tuesday, carried the cold, unforgiving weight of officialdom. Laura opened it and felt the air drain from the room. The initial fine stated was $200 for a violation of Bylaw 4.1c, improper remediation of pet waste. But it wasn't the initial fine that stopped her heart, it was the addendum. The letter explained that because this was the third meaningful violation in a 90-day period, a claim Laura knew was impossible, the fine automatically escalated to the maximum punitive penalty allowed under the board's newly revised and previously unannounced schedule. A staggering, incomprehensible $10,000. Laura's disbelief quickly curdled into cold fury. The two prior violations cited were boilerplate form letters she tossed aside weeks ago, one for a speculative non-pickup and another for leaving Barnaby unattended on the community bench for 40 seconds. Now those minor petty grievances had culminated in a financial demand that represented nearly 3 months of her salary. This wasn't about enforcing cleanliness. This was about power, intimidation, and crushing dissent. This was Arthur. Her first step was logical and polite, an appeal. She drafted a meticulous 10-page rebuttal complete with dated photos of her waste bag dispenser and Barnaby's dentist records to prove the dog's minuscule output. She highlighted the ambiguity of the new fine schedule and demanded to see the evidence of the specific transgression that triggered the $10,000 penalty. The response was swift, brutal, and profoundly chilling. Arthur didn't just deny the appeal. He scheduled a special, unscheduled disciplinary hearing and delivered the notice via a neighborhood deputy, making a public spectacle of the confrontation. The fine was upheld, and the deputy delivered a verbal message. The board had witness testimony and photographic evidence. The payment was due within 14 days, or a lien would be placed on her property. The absurdity was reaching a breaking point. Laura realized this was no longer a misunderstanding. It was a target on her back. The next 2 weeks became a pressure cooker. Arthur and the board, emboldened by their perceived victory, began tightening the screws. They sent an inspector to her property, citing violations so minute they were farcical. The shade of green on her front door was marginally outside the approved color swatch, and a small potted lemon tree on her patio was considered unapproved landscaping. Each came with compounding daily fines. They were trying to financially bleed her out before the deadline. Laura felt the helplessness acutely. She was spending every evening poring over Pelican Creek's arcane, confusing, and contradictory bylaws, looking for a defense, a weakness, any kind of leverage. What she found was a labyrinth of confusing legal language and vague committee structures that seemed intentionally designed to obscure the truth. The tension was beginning to affect her work, her sleep, and her sense of security within her own home. One sleepless night, while cross-referencing a fine for unauthorized exterior holiday lighting from 4 years ago, she noticed something truly peculiar in the HOA's publicly available financial disclosures, specifically the line item for Community Beautification and Improvement Fund. This fund, intended for playground upgrades and pool maintenance, showed a massive, unaccounted-for spike in spending over the past 2 years, correlating perfectly with Arthur's tenure as president. The amounts weren't small, tens of thousands of dollars allocated for projects that, as far as Laura or any of the other residents could tell, had simply never materialized. There was $35,000 for a gate entry upgrade. That never happened. $18,000 for new pool furniture that looked suspiciously like the old worn-out set. Arthur wasn't just abusing his power, he might be stealing. The $10,000 Poodle fine suddenly took on a new, darker meaning. It was a convenient, large injection of cash to cover a gap. Laura knew she couldn't take on the board alone, especially not Arthur, who controlled the narrative and the legal firm on retainer. She needed allies, and she needed proof that couldn't be dismissed as a disgruntled neighbor's paranoia. Laura reached out to 2 residents she vaguely knew, Mark, who had a background in auditing, and Susan, a longtime resident who often voiced quiet frustration about the lack of pool maintenance. Meeting secretly at an off-site coffee shop, the 3 of them began to meticulously dissect the public documents. Mark, with his sharp financial eye, confirmed Laura's suspicions. The expenditures didn't just seem suspicious, they looked like shell payments to fictitious or suspiciously named companies that had no physical presence. One major payment for landscaping equipment went to an LLC whose registered address was a P.O. box in a distant state. The total suspected misappropriated funds were quickly escalated past $200,000. The new goal was no longer just about avoiding the $10,000 fine. It was about exposing Arthur and the board's massive breach of fiduciary duty. Laura had found the leverage, but they needed a public stage for the confrontation. The annual general meeting, AGM, was 3 weeks away, a required, legally binding event where the board had to face the community. Laura and her small team knew they had to be ready to deliver the complete, devastating evidence to every resident at once, ensuring Arthur couldn't use his usual tactics of delay and intimidation. The tension is now electrifying, transforming fear into strategic resolution. But Arthur was not alone in falling back. He had eyes everywhere in Pelican Creek, and one small slip could derail their entire operation. Laura knew he was waiting for the fine deadline to pass, unaware that she was not preparing a defense, but a coup. The community was about to learn just how corrupt the pursuit of perfect lawns could be.
The annual general meeting, or AGM, was historically a dull, poorly attended affair, a predictable procession of Arthur reading pre-written reports and residents quickly rubber-stamping the budget so they could get back to their quiet lives. This year, however, the air in the community clubhouse felt thick, charged with anticipation. Laura and her team had worked diligently, but anticipated, circulating flyers announced a critical review of HOA finances that successfully swelled attendance. Every chair was filled, neighbors who had never spoken to one another exchanging tense, knowing glances. Arthur, seated at the head table with the rest of the board, wore a smug, unwavering smile, treating the unusual turnout as a tribute to his leadership. The meeting began with the usual formality. Arthur rushed through the minutes and budgetary reports, clearly eager to reach the predictable vote and dismiss the gathering. When he casually mentioned the final disposition of Laura's account, his eyes flickered toward her, a moment of silence, condescending victory. And finally, he announced, his voice booming with authority, the outstanding debt of Miss Peterson has been resolved according to our bylaws. Her property now faces a lien due to non-payment of a substantial fine, protecting the community's assets. He expected silence, perhaps a few whispers. Instead, Laura stood, the room instantly hushed. She walked calmly to the front, carrying not just a briefcase, but the collective hope and fury of dozens of financial homeowners threatened. Arthur attempted to shut her down immediately, pounding his gavel. "Sit down, Miss Peterson. This is not the appropriate forum for personal grievances. You are disrupting the meeting." Laura ignored the gavel. Her voice, usually soft, projects with an unearning steadiness. "I'm not here to discuss my $10,000 fine, Arthur. I'm here to discuss the $200,000 that has disappeared from our community's accounts." The effect was instantaneous and electrifying. A gasp swept across the room. Arthur's composure finally fractured. His face went from smug dismissal to a terrifying mask of panic and rage. "This is slander. Security, remove this woman." But no one moved. The residents were frozen, their eyes locked on Laura, who placed the set of large, professionally printed posters onto an easel near the podium. The first poster was a simple, damning comparison, the HOA's stated spending on landscaping maintenance versus the actual, independently verified contracts. The discrepancy was stark. "Arthur claimed we spent $80,000 last year on new lawn equipment," Laura stated, pointing to the figures. "The local contractor who services the common areas confirmed he was paid less than half that amount, and no new equipment was ever purchased." Arthur was now scrambling, shouting over her, waving his hands wildly. "These are unverified rumors, confidential information. She has no authority to present this." But Laura kept the pace relentlessly. She moved to the next poster, a flowchart tracing the $35,000 gate entry upgrade payment. "This check," she said, holding up a blown-up image of the transaction, "was written to AC Me Holdings LLC, ostensibly a gate contractor. However, AC Me Holdings LLC was registered less than a year ago to a P.O. box in Miami, and the sole signatory on the bank account is—" She paused, letting the suspense build until it was almost unbearable. "Arthur's younger brother, who lives 2 states away and runs a failing kite shop." The clubhouse erupted into shouts. Neighbors were on their feet, demanding answers, pointing accusatory fingers at Arthur, whose face was now beet red, sweat beading on his forehead. The other, silent board members, looked everywhere but at the crowd, suddenly desperate to distance themselves. The true climax, however, was yet to come. Arthur, realizing his game was collapsing, made one final desperate power play. He grabbed the gavel and slammed it down repeatedly. "This meeting is adjourned. I hereby declare all votes null and void, and this entire proceeding is dismissed." He stood up, knocked his chair backward, and began shoving his papers into his briefcase, clearly preparing to flee the scene and control the damage from a distance. But Laura had anticipated this thanks to Mark's meticulous legal research. Just as Arthur reached the door, intending to make his escape, Susan, the longtime resident, stood up holding a thick binder. She cleared her throat, her voice trembling slightly, but firm. "Arthur, Section 7.2 of the Pelican Creek bylaws states that in the event of suspected gross negligence or malfeasance by the board president, a petition signed by 25% of the membership forces an immediate no-confidence vote, which must be conducted by secret ballot before adjournment." She then dropped a stack of papers onto the table, petition sheets, not signed by 25%, but over half of the homeowners present. The room went silent again, a deep, satisfied silence of procedural victory. Arthur's eyes widened in disbelief. The realization hit him. He couldn't legally leave. He couldn't adjourn the meeting. He was trapped in a room full of people who now knew he was a thief. The subsequent vote was a formality, but a glorious one. The majority was overwhelming. Arthur and his complicit board members were summarily stripped of their power and removed from office, effective immediately. The reign of terror, fueled by petty rules and capped with a $10,000 Poodle fine, ended not with a whimper, but with the resounding public humiliation of a failed autocrat. The only thing left to do was pick up the pieces and ensure that the law finally caught up to the man who tried to weaponize community rules for personal gain. The immediate aftermath of the no-confidence vote was a dizzying mix of elation and administrative chaos. The former board members, utterly defeated, gathered their belongings and fled the clubhouse, their years of unchecked authority evaporating into the night air. Arthur, in particular, left in a state of mortified silence, realizing that the $10,000 fine he had issued had not secured his petty tyranny, but had instead acted as the precise catalyst for his downfall. He had intended to punish a single resident. He had succeeded only in uniting the entire community against him. With Arthur gone, an interim board was quickly established, with Laura, Mark, and Susan unanimously voted in as temporary officers to manage the immediate crisis. The first and most satisfying official act of the new board was the immediate and retroactive nullification of every single fine levied under the old regime, starting, of course, with Laura's absurded $10,000 Poodle fine. The residents who had been living under the shadow of arbitrary penalties felt a collective, profound release. The community breathed easier for the first time in years. However, nullifying the fines was the easy part. The real work lay in untangling the web of financial malfeasance Arthur had woven. Mark, now acting as the interim treasurer, took point. The investigation that followed went deeper and was far uglier than even Laura's initial audit suggested. Arthur hadn't just used shell companies registered to his brother, he had also funneled money into two seemingly legitimate vendor accounts that, upon close inspection, were paying inflated invoices for services that were either never fully rendered or performed poorly by companies tied directly to his personal friends and associates. The total amount of misused or unaccounted for funds eventually surpassed $240,000. This revelation sent a fresh wave of outrage through Pelican Creek. It became clear that the pettiness, the nitpicking over mailbox colors, the policing of lawn grass height, the obsessive monitoring of dog waste was not just about control, it was a distraction. While the residents were busy fighting over small, visible infractions, Arthur and his co-conspirators were quietly emptying the community coffers. The interim board hired a dedicated forensic auditor and, armed with irrefutable evidence, presented their findings to the district attorney. The legal proceedings were long and complicated, but the paper trail was devastatingly clear. The $10,000 Poodle fine became Exhibit A in the prosecution's case, a perfect example of Arthur's willingness to weaponize his position for financial gain using punitive action to rapidly inject cash into the very fund he was draining. The long-term consequences for Arthur were significant and final. He was eventually charged and faced significant legal penalties for embezzlement and fraud. The satisfaction was palpable, yet it was bittersweet. While justice was served, the HOA's reserves had been decimated, meaning the community had to collectively absorb the losses. The promised pool renovation and the road resurfacing project were indefinitely shelved. The cost of exposing the corruption was paid for, ultimately, by the community Arthur had sworn to serve. But the story of Pelican Creek was not defined by its loss, it was defined by its incredible transformation. The new permanent board, led by a newly elected Laura as president, instituted radical changes. They implemented an ironclad transparency policy, ensuring every single invoice, contract, and expense over a minimal amount was posted online for immediate public review. They rewrote the most draconian and ridiculous bylaws, prioritizing neighborly engagement over petty conformity. The $10,000 fine had fostered a community spirit that had been missing since the neighborhood's inception. Neighbors began talking, collaborating, and truly working together, replacing the culture of suspicion and fear with one of mutual accountability. Laura, who only months earlier was disenchanted over a lien on her own, became the unlikely champion of this new era. She proved that the fight against corruption often begins not with a grand political gesture, but with the courage to challenge a seemingly small, yet deeply unjust act. Her message to the community and indeed to the outside world was simple, yet profound. If you allow the authority figures in your life to impose absurdity without consequence, you are tacitly accepting tyranny. The poodle, Barnaby, became an unofficial, fluffy mascot for the new regime, the accidental instigator of reform. His innocent transgression, magnified tenfold by a power-hungry man, led to a revolution that restored honesty and democracy to Pelican Creek. The community learned that the true purpose of an HOA is not to control, but to empower. The final takeaway from this epic battle is a stark reminder to every homeowner. The bylaws, the budget, and the power resides with you. When you look at the absurd, petty disputes that dominate so many neighborhoods, ask yourself this: are these rules truly for the benefit of the community, or are they a calculated smokescreen, drawing your attention to the dandelions while someone quietly cleans out the treasury? The choice between conformity and courage is often the difference between being ruled by a tyrant and governing officials.
How many Arthurs are sitting at your community board table waiting for their own chance to weaponize a $10,000 fine?